Now picture this. You're having an argument with a friend of yours. So you lay forth all the facts, all the data, all the information, all the talking points, all the evidence that you need to back up your claims. Now, in any reasonable society, this friend of yours would respond to you with something like, you know what? Perhaps you're right. Maybe this time I got it all wrong. Or at the very least, you'll get silence. But in India, I don't get any of that. Instead, we get deflection, we get whataboutery, we get changing of goalposts, personal attacks, and sometimes even worse, doubling down. Does this sound familiar? Because this ain't just about pride or ego either. It's a pattern. It's a deep, widespread, uniquely intense pattern to India. From households to boardrooms, from politics to WhatsApp groups, admitting your mistakes here in India is seen as akin to admitting to a crime. But why though? Is it our upbringing? Is it pride? Is it arrogance? Or is it fear? So today we're going to look into this particular aspect of our society. So without further ado, let's begin. In many Indian societies, hierarchy doesn't just exist. It becomes a very integral part of our everyday life. From childhood, people are taught to recognize and respect rank. Older over younger, parents over children, teachers over students, manager over employees, and politicians over citizens. From the outside, it seems like this hierarchy creates order. But it also causes a problem. It creates a belief, a presumption almost, a belief that authority is always right. Admitting your mistakes in a healthy environment is often seen as a sign of maturity and self-awareness. But within a rigid hierarchy, it often gets interpreted differently. It feels like a loss of status. When someone higher in the hierarchy admits they were wrong, it can feel, at least to them, like they're stepping down from their position of power, even if only momentarily. A lot of the times, these decisions aren't conscious, they're conditioned. For example, a parent may hesitate to apologize to their child because they feel it might disrupt the dynamic they share. If they admit fault, they fear it might blur the line between authority and equality. The same applies to teachers in classrooms, managers in offices, and elders in families. The role they occupy comes with an unspoken expectation. You're always supposed to know better. So when they don't, the only reasonable option is deflection, denial, or justification. Over time, this creates a culture where being right is tied to identity. Authority figures begin to equate correctness with competence. If they are wrong, they don't just feel mistaken, they feel diminished. And that feeling is uncomfortable enough to avoid at all costs. What makes this even more complex is how younger individuals are raised within this system. Children grow up rarely seeing apologies from those above them. Disagreements are often shut down with phrases like, "I know better," or "you'll understand when you're older." This reinforces the idea that power means certainty. And by this definition, uncertainty becomes weakness. So what happens when these children grow up? They carry the same pattern forward. When they become adults, they don't develop the ability to admit their fault comfortably. Why? Because they were never shown how. Instead, they replicate what they observe. They defend, deflect, or stay silent. This behavior creates a cycle. Each generation inherits the same discomfort with being wrong, especially in positions of authority. And because hierarchy still exists, the pressure to maintain that image of always knowing continues. But here's the paradox. True authority doesn't come from being always right. It comes from being secure enough to admit when you're not. In fact, when someone in a position of power acknowledges a mistake, it often increases respect rather than diminishes it. It humanizes them, it builds trust, it creates space for honesty in others. But the issue here is this perspective is rarely accepted. Breaking this pattern requires a huge shift, not just in the hierarchy itself, but also in how authority is expressed within it. Authority doesn't have to mean infallibility. It can also mean responsibility, accountability, and the ability to self-correct. Because at the end of the day, our fear isn't really about being wrong. It's about what being wrong means. In a society where power is tied to certainty, admitting fault feels like giving something up, when in reality, it's one of the strongest things a person can do. Psychologists often divide cultures into two different types. First is the guilt culture, and the second is shame culture. In a guilt-based culture, the focus is internal. When someone does something wrong, The discomfort comes from within. It's about personal values, conscience, and an internal sense of right and wrong. Even if no one else knows, the individual still feels compelled to correct themselves or admit fault. But in a shame based culture, the focus shifts outward. The question is no longer, did I do something wrong? It becomes, what will people think if they find out? In many Indian social environments, behavior is heavily influenced by social perception. Reputation here isn't just personal, it's collective. It reflects on family, status, and identity. Now, because of that, mistakes are not seen as just errors, they're seen as exposures. Admitting fault in this case isn't just about acknowledging a mistake, it becomes an act that risks embarrassment, judgment, or even loss of respect in the eyes of others. So people learn to avoid that exposure. Instead of openly admitting they were wrong, they may downplay the situation, shift blame, justify their actions, or simply stay silent. Not necessarily because they lack awareness, but because the cost of being seen as wrong feels too high. This is why, in many situations, people are more concerned with saving face than with resolving the issue itself. You'll notice this in small, everyday interactions. Someone might clearly make a mistake in a conversation but refuse to acknowledge it. Why? Because admitting it publicly creates discomfort, it draws attention, it opens the door to judgment. From childhood, we are all taught how you appear matters more than what you feel. Being correct, composed, and socially acceptable becomes a priority. Vulnerability, especially in the form of admitting fault, is rarely encouraged. Instead, we have an unspoken rule: do not let others see you fail. And this conditioning creates a disconnect. Internally, a person may recognize their mistake. They may even feel regret. But externally, they maintain a different narrative, one that protects their image. So, obviously, the issue is never fully addressed, and the cycle continues. What makes this even more complex is that shame doesn't just come from others, it becomes internalized. Over time, people begin to monitor themselves constantly, anticipating judgment even when none is present. This makes admitting fault feel risky, even in safe environments. Guilt says, I did something bad. Shame says, I will be seen as a bad person if people see that I did something bad. And when that shift happens, the goal is no longer growth. It's protection. It's saving face. The result of this is a culture where mistakes are hidden rather than discussed, defended rather than examined. And while this may preserve short-term social comfort, it comes at the cost of long-term emotional honesty. Because real accountability requires visibility. It requires the ability to say, I was wrong, without attaching that statement to one's entire worth or identity. Moving from a system driven by external judgment to one guided by internal awareness doesn't mean ignoring social norms, because at its core, admitting fault isn't about losing respect. It's all about building integrity even when no one is watching. Long before adulthood, long before workplace dynamics or family expectations fully take shape, one of the earliest environments that shapes our relationship with mistakes is school. And for many, school was not a place where being wrong was part of learning. Instead, it was a place where being wrong came with consequences. From the very beginning, correctness is rewarded and mistakes are highlighted. Marks, ranks, red pen corrections, public comparisons, the entire system is structured around evaluation. There's a clear binary, right or wrong. And where there's binary, there's judgment. If you answered correctly, you were praised. If you didn't, you were corrected, often publicly. Over time, this creates an association. Being wrong means embarrassment, loss of approval, sometimes even punishment. This doesn't just affect academic performance. It shapes how a person feels about making mistakes altogether. Think about a typical classroom scenario. A teacher asks a question, and only a few students raise their hands. These are usually the ones who are confident they know the answer. The rest, they stay silent, even if they have a guess. Why? Because the risk of being wrong in front of others feels uncomfortable. That hesitation isn't natural, it's learned. In an ideal learning environment, mistakes are supposed to be neutral, even valuable. They show where understanding is incomplete. They create opportunities for growth. But when mistakes are consistently linked with negative experiences, students stop seeing them as a part of learning. They start seeing them as something to avoid. Don't try unless you're sure. Don't speak unless you're right. And this mindset doesn't just stay confined to the classroom. As students grow into adults, the same fear follows them into conversations, relationships, and professional settings. Admitting I don't know or I was wrong feels just as uncomfortable as it did back in school because it triggers the same internal response: exposure, judgment, and a loss of standing. What reinforces this further is the lack of modeling from authority figures within the education system itself. Teachers are expected to have answers. Rarely do students see a teacher openly admit uncertainty or acknowledge a mistake. And when they do, it's often treated as unusual. So the message becomes clear: the one in authority is supposed to be right. Always. Students internalize not just information, but also behavior. They learn that being correct earns respect, while being wrong risks losing it. Another layer to this is how success is narrowly defined. High marks, top ranks, and academic performance become the primary indicators of intelligence and capability. There's little room for experimentation, creative risk taking, or learning through failure. When outcomes matter more than the process, mistakes become liabilities instead of lessons. So instead of asking, "What can I learn from this?" people start asking, "How do I avoid being wrong again?" Now, herein lies the main problem. This behavior reduces curiosity. It limits honest dialogue. It makes people defensive rather than reflective. By the time individuals leave the education system, many have already developed a deep discomfort with being wrong. Not because they lack the ability to learn, but because they've been conditioned to associate mistakes with negative consequences. Now, breaking this pattern requires rethinking what mistakes mean, because in reality, being wrong is not a failure of intelligence. It's a natural part of understanding. But when an entire system treats it as something to be corrected quickly, hidden quietly, or even avoided entirely, people don't just learn subjects. They learn to protect themselves from being seen as wrong. And that lesson stays with them for far longer than anything written in a textbook. Before school, before society, before any structured system begins shaping behavior, there is one place where patterns are formed most deeply: family. It's the first environment where a child learns how conflict works, how emotions are handled, and most importantly, how mistakes are treated. But in a lot of Indian households, there's one thing children rarely see: a parent saying sorry. This absence might seem small on the surface, but its impact is significant. When parents don't apologize, it sends a subtle but powerful message to kids, not through words, but through behavior. It teaches the child that authority does not admit fault, that being older or in charge of something somehow places you above the need to acknowledge mistakes. And children don't just listen, they observe, they absorb, they imitate. If a parent reacts harshly, then later acts normal without addressing it, the child learns that behavior too. The child learns that conflicts don't need resolution. They just need to be ignored until they fade away. If a parent makes a mistake but justifies it instead of owning it, the child learns that defending oneself is more important than being honest. Over time, this becomes the child's emotional blueprint. They grow up understanding relationships not as spaces for open accountability, but as spaces where ego is quietly protected. What makes this more complex is that many parents are not intentionally avoiding apologies. They often believe they are maintaining discipline, respect, or even authority. In their understanding, apologizing to a child might feel like weakening their position or encouraging disobedience. So they choose control over vulnerability. But there are unintended consequences to this. The child never learns what a healthy apology looks like. They don't learn that you can make a mistake and still be respected. They don't learn that acknowledging fault can actually strengthen relationships. They don't learn that accountability and authority can coexist. Instead, they grow up associating apologies with discomfort, awkwardness, or even weakness. And when they eventually find themselves in positions where they need to apologize, whether in friendships, relationships, or professional settings, they struggle. And this is not because they don't feel regret, but rather this is because they don't have the language or emotional experience to express this particular regret. So, what do they do instead? They delay, they minimize, they deflect. Sometimes they stay silent, hoping time will fix something that honesty could have resolved much earlier. This pattern often continues across generations. A child who never received an apology grows into an adult who doesn't know how to give one. And when they become parents, they unknowingly repeat the same behavior. Because to them, this is what normal looks like. But here's the reality: children don't lose respect for parents who apologize. If anything, they understand them better. They get closer to them. When a parent says, "I was wrong," it doesn't reduce their authority, it redefines it. It shows that authority is not just about being perfect, it's also about being responsible. It creates emotional safety. It teaches the child that mistakes are not something to hide, but something to acknowledge and learn from. And that lesson is far more valuable than maintaining a fake image. Because in the long run, what children carry forward is not what they are told, it's what they see. And if they never saw accountability modeled at home, they won't naturally practice it in the world. If there's one thread that quietly ties everything together, like hierarchy, shame, education, and family, it's this: the need to maintain a certain image. Not just who you are, but how you are seen. In many Indian social settings, identity is not entirely personal. It's often constructed and constantly evaluated through the lens of others: relatives, neighbors, colleagues, and even strangers. Reputation becomes something that you carry everywhere, and more importantly, something that you must protect, no matter the cost. Now, because of this, people don't just act based on what's right or wrong. Instead, they act based on what will look right. Admitting fault here is no longer just about acknowledging a mistake. It becomes a threat to the image you've built. If people have always seen you as responsible, composed, or knowledgeable, then saying "I was wrong" feels like cracking that identity. It introduces doubt. It opens the door for others to see you differently. So instead of correcting that mistake, people often double down. They justify their actions, they reframe the situation, they avoid direct acknowledgement. Now, this is not because they don't understand the truth. This is because truth, if expressed openly, can create conflict. This is especially visible in social and family dynamics. A person may know they've hurt someone, but instead of apologizing, they act normally, as if nothing has happened. Why? Because bringing it up would require admitting fault, and that admission could shift how others see them. Over time, appearances become more important than authenticity. Conversations become less honest. Conflicts remain unresolved. Relationships carry unspoken tension. And yet, on the surface, everything looks fine. What makes this even more ingrained is how early it starts. From a young age, many people are taught directly or indirectly to behave properly, to not create a scene, to think about what others will say. Now, these phrases may seem necessary in certain contexts, but when repeated over time, they build a mindset where external perception becomes the primary filter for behavior. So, when a mistake happens, the first instinct isn't reflection, it's calculation. How will this look? What version of this situation keeps me in a better light? And in that moment, truth takes a back seat. Maintaining an image requires consistency, and truth requires honesty. When someone becomes too attached to their image, they start resisting anything that threatens it. But the irony in this is, people don't lose respect because they admit mistakes. They lose trust when they clearly avoid them. Because others can easily sense when somebody is trying to hide something or deflect. And because of this behavior, maybe the image might remain intact on the surface, but the authenticity behind it starts to fade. You see, real strength isn't in appearing flawless, it's in being real enough to acknowledge imperfection. Because at the end of the day, an image can protect how you're seen, but only honesty can sustain how you're understood. Being wrong is not weakness, staying wrong is. Every culture has its blind spots, but ours has turned stubbornness into a virtue, silence into dignity, and deflection into an art form. And it's costing us in relationships, in workplaces, in trust, in growth. You see, the most respected people in the world, the ones who actually lead, who build real relationships, they all share one common trait. They can look someone in the eye and say, I got that wrong. That's not defeat, that's character. So the next time you find yourself defending the indefensible, to deflect, to disappear, pause for a moment and ask yourself this: am I protecting my pride or am I protecting my growth? Because you can either guard your ego or you can evolve, but you can't do both. Hey, now before you leave, can you just drop a like and leave a comment? So that's gonna help my channel grow a bit. It's gonna help with the algorithm and stuff. I'd really appreciate it if you did that.